Geopolitical Military Analysis here at Hudson Institute. Today I have the opportunity to host a distinguished group of international experts to introduce you to our new report on managing China-related proliferation challenges. The research for this report was generously funded by the Counterproliferation and Arms Control Center, part of the United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office. Given our limited time today, we hope to tantalize you with some observations to entice you to read the entire report, or parts of it, which will be posted on the Hudson website. So if people have questions or comments, feel free to write me later. I'm happy to address those. You'll see that the report is comprehensive. We tried to look at both the question of China's impact on vertical proliferation, how its buildup was affecting pressures to increase nuclear forces in many countries, as well as the potential for horizontal proliferation, the possible effects of China's policies on states of proliferation concerns, such as North Korea and Iran, and also the risks of diversion of nuclear materials and technologies to non-state actors, particularly terrorists. China's nuclear buildup, has been noted by many, is awesome. It's been rapidly increasing not only its nuclear warheads, but also its delivery systems and improving their effectiveness. China is now has the full panoply of a nuclear triad with strategic submarines, strategic bombers, and especially long-range ballistic missiles that are all capable of launching nuclear weapons. We also have seen China still, despite this buildup, refuse to participate in nuclear arms reduction talks formally, or even through engage with many countries on risk reduction measures. In our view, China's buildup is having an adverse effect on global security and regional security issues. It's complicating the military planning of states. It's increasing strategic unpredictability. It risks decreasing crisis instability, and it is encouraging the proliferation of nuclear weapons and their means of delivery to other states. Regarding this latter point, we've seen Chinese government reduce its support for international sanctions on states of proliferation concern, North Korea and Iran, and others as well. And we've also seen growing concerns about the implementation of sanctions by Chinese entities, even the ones earlier adopted by the Chinese government. With regard to nuclear security measures designed to keep nuclear material away from non-state actors, there's a continued Chinese local support for these initiatives, but the transparency of China's activities in this area has been decreasing, while its nuclear buildup has been raising concerns about what's happening, how secure all that additional fissile material has become. One of the key chapters in our report addresses the impact of Chinese policies on both Koreas. This chapter was written by Yongjun Kim of the Korean National Defense University and Nisul Wu, a scholar at the King's College London. And I'll let them identify for us what they think to be the 2 or 3 main points of their chapter.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. I mainly cover the chapter about the South and North Korea's perspectives with Professor Kim. So let me say a few words about how South Korea's response to China's nuclear development. Since the current Yoon Suk-yeol administration, Seoul tried to build strong ties with Washington compared to the previous Moon Jae-in administration. During the presidential campaign, Yoon announced a plan to deploy additional THAAD missile defense system in an effort to respond to national security needs. Not only this, President Yoon also increased the military budget for the nation's security. Nowadays, the South Korean public discussed the development of its own nuclear weapons. In particular, on 11th of January 2023, President Yoon's remarks on nuclear armaments are also statements that reflect the public opinion of South Korea. So discussions on this issue are continuing. So this public opinion can be seen as remarks about China's accelerating nuclear developments as well as the North Korean nuclear threat. As a result of a survey commissioned by the Uni-Korea Foundation at Joseon-Ilbo and the Institute for Social Development and Policy Research at Seoul National University between 14th and 21st of November last year, 68% of Korean youth in their 20s and 30s said they were in favor of possessing nuclear weapons. So developing nuclear weapons cannot solve the North Korean nuclear threats. However, this phenomenon has quite a long history. For the Korean people, nuclear weapons possess symbolic meaning, not a hypersonic missiles, not THAAD or other high-impact weapons. The reason why the South Korean public talked about nuclear weapon is because many people knew North Korea will not give up its nuclear weapons. Also, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has sent a warning that if a conflict over Taiwan will arise, there is a possibility of North Korea attacking South Korea. Therefore, this current public opinion can be seen as reflecting the people's concerns not only about the North Korean nuclear threat, but also from a long-term perspective as a measure to prepare for China's accelerating nuclear development and Northeast Asia security more broadly. So the view that China's nuclear development is challenging along with the North Korean nuclear threat is quite common. The one reason for this is that China and Russia exercise their veto power over the sanctions resolution against North Korea. Therefore, President Yoon has a clearer stance about the North Korean nuclear threat and China's nuclear development. That's it from my side, and Professor Kim will explain more about North Korea's perspective.
Yeah, and he explained how Chinese nuclear development impact on North Korean view. There is no official document or response of the North Korean government to China's military power rise or nuclear power rise. But for the long history between the PLC and DPRK, we can simply assess on the how North Korean perspective on the Chinese nuclear rise. It is we can express about double-edged sword because North Korea definitely happy to have a more strong neighbor against especially ROC, U.S., Japan security cooperation. But interestingly, at the same time, North Korea has unhappy about the too much strong Chinese military power because the history of PRC and DPRK relation clearly shows North Korea always has a fear about the too much strong Chinese military power because of possible political intervention into the North Korean domestic politics. For example, 1956 military coup against Kim Il-sung as a more pro-Chinese faction of North Korean politician tried to do. And that's why Kim Il-sung decided to the withdrawal of all Chinese voluntary forces in the late 1950. Eisenhower introduced the tactical nuclear weapons to the South Korean territory. And recently, Kim Jong-un purged Jang Song-taek, his uncle, for the name of the too much close to Chinese political faction and Chinese politician. So this kind of feeling is the North Korea to feel about the Chinese military power. Even during the international sanction early 2000, especially strong participation of the China and Russian government at the time, North Korea moved to the KPA forces there by the Yalu River. So in this kind of example also supported the North Korean view. Also, there has been no single combined exercise between the PLA and the KPA. And also, there's no official liaison officer between the two countries, even a single officer. So, interestingly, North Koreans fear about too much dependent on the Chinese power, not just economically, because of their trade more than 98% of the China. So North Korea, Kim Jong-un definitely happy to have a stronger neighbor, but at the same time, very fear about the potential political intervention into the North Korean Juche ideology. But anyway, possible option between the PLA, KPA, and military cooperation is also possible at this time because of ROC U.S.-Japan security cooperation has increased, and also U.S.-China struggle will be more stronger. So we need to closely watch the how North Korean want to use China's nuclear power rise. So from this paper, I'd like to suggest that this kind of North Korea double-edged feeling about the Chinese nuclear rise. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for that interesting discussion. The next chapter of the report was written by Hudson Institute Japan Chair Fellow Kome Sasaki, and I'll let him share with us what he thinks were the key insights from his research.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this important project and this event as well. So Japan's policies about the Chinese nuclear force development has not been really targeted in the past. But however, China's growing military capabilities, including its nuclear buildup and North Korea's increasing nuclear missile capabilities and Russia's most recent aggressive behavior in Ukraine, I think it has been a major driver in forcing Japan to fundamentally transform Japan's defense policy in the post-World War II period. Japan's disarmament and non-proliferation policy was very strong and has a strong root in the Japan's unique experience at the end of World War II, where Japan received some atomic weapons attacks in the cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so Japan's commitment to nuclear disarmament was really strong, despite growing threat surrounding countries. However, Japanese policymakers made unprecedented decisions recently to increase large-scale increase of defense budgets, doubling it by 2027, and acquire capabilities, including counter-strike systems and counter-strike capabilities, and we call it standoff missiles. And these developments surrounding countries push Japan to remodernize. Of course, all the points we have seen in the strategy documents released last December were reflection of the Japan's struggle to reform and develop security strategy and capabilities in the past 2 or 3 decades. But I think the last year's Russia's aggression into Ukraine territory is, I think, a fundamental, also maybe final push to Japan's public to realize aggression in what by the nation states could occur under the UN charters. And even Japan expressed its worry about even the international order supported by UN charter may be violated, explicitly violated by UN Security Council members. So they use the word, this is the most severe environment since the end of the World War II. And in looking back to history, so Japan was in the 1960s when it was discussing the joining a non-proliferation treaty, NPT treaty process. China will be formally recognize a nuclear power, whereas Japan did not have such capabilities. And in that process, also later 1960s and early 1970s, Japan was normalizing relationship with China, People's Republic of China, as a sole government of Chinese territories. And so during that process, the leaders of two countries discussed the dealing with nuclear weapons. And Chinese, it is reported that the Chinese leaders, Zhou Enlai, Prime Minister at the time, promised to Prime Minister Kakure Tanaka that China's military capability would be minimum and only for minimum counter-strike or deterrence against the United States. They would not use against Japan. And Japanese side said reportedly that Japan have capabilities and the technology to develop nuclear weapons, but they wouldn't trusting China's commitment. However, in the past, particularly after the 2000s and maybe last 5 years, China's very rapid growing capabilities may have, I think, broke that so-called gentleman's agreement between the People's Republic of China and Japan, that China's nuclear capability is a minimum. So China's non-first use policy is still maintained, but I think looking at their capabilities and their behaviors in East and South China Seas about aggressive activities, so that is made Japanese public and policymakers really worry about the Chinese capabilities. So, so those developments pushed Japan to transform its sort of prohibition to counter-strike capabilities. So I should mention that Japan's defense policies has consistencies. So, so legal framework has not changed since 2016, when Prime Minister Abe introduced the so-called collective self-defense. So exercising a limited collective self-defense. That was a controversy at the time, but at this time, there was no such big resistance from the Japanese public at the time, last December, because of those, I think, worsening international situations. So I think Japan developed strategy changed. So implementation is in the future. So it's not easy. So gradually increasing defense budget under Japan's economic constraints. So we're gonna have, we need to see real implementation of Japan's strategies in the future. And I think it's important to note that Japan and Korea is discussing much more closely. Republic of Korea and President Yoon visited Japan with very courageous decisions and approach. And Japan is so far favorably responding. I think this trend is very important to see to strengthen our security. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a chapter on China and Iran as well. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into that. People are welcome to read it on the website, but Hudson has also published a lot of material on the Iran-China relationship and held several events. I encourage people to, when they're on the website, look at those as well. The relationship between China's nuclear policies and European response was dealt with by Max Ho presently at the European Leadership Network. And I'll let him share with us the key points he wants us to draw from this chapter.
Thanks very much indeed, Richard. Now, in my chapter on European perspectives on China's nuclear policy, I essentially argue that there appears to be a growing consensus in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom on the imperative of essentially engaging China on much more competitive terms. I also find that nuclear issues are much less visible in the public debate about China in Europe compared with the United States. So there are just a few points that I'd like to highlight really briefly. I begin with Germany. I think what's really interesting about Germany's China policy is that there appears to have been a significant rhetorical shift from Chancellor Merkel to Chancellor Scholz. Now, for much of the Merkel administration, commentators seem to suggest that Merkel essentially subscribed to an overall China strategy dubbed Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade. But that is not actually the case. Merkel herself described her China strategy and her Russia strategy, for that matter, in much more nuanced terms. Merkel said after leaving office that, quote, "I didn't believe in Wandel durch Handel, but in Verbindung durch Handel, or connection through trade." So I think it's very clear from this that for Merkel, the overarching foreign policy priority towards Russia, at least, was to expand trade ties with Moscow. But instead of hoping that increasing economic linkages would deliver political liberalization, Merkel's aim overall, I think, was to stabilize Russia-West relations while at the same time, of course, boosting Germany's economy. And I think it's the very same logic that also guided Merkel's China policy. Since Merkel left office, there were a number of turning points in Germany's policy towards China. In the interest of time, I'll just pick out one really quickly. I think there was a major shift in German foreign policy towards Russia with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, which led Chancellor Scholz to declare a new era of German foreign policy called Zeitenwende. Some of the core characteristics of this turn in German foreign policy were not only the creation of a special fund of 100 billion euros to close capability gaps in the armed forces, but also the adoption of a much more hawkish stance toward Russia, as well as the scaling back of economic ties with Russia. So when we look at the latest trade data between November 2021 and November 2022, German exports to Russia were actually down 52.8%, and German imports from Russia were down by 56.2%. I think it's obvious that Scholz's Zeitenwende has implications for his China policy as well. Indeed, he actually wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in January setting out his thinking on China. And what's interesting in my view is that he doesn't really give in to pressure from the public debate in Germany to scale back on economic interdependence with China. Instead, Scholz says that, quote, "While Germany and its partners in the EU, the United States, the G7 and NATO must protect our open societies, stand up for our democratic values and strengthen our alliances and partnerships, we must also avoid the temptation to once again divide the world into blocs." And when you look at opinion data on this, again, the German public, roughly half of the German public advocates that the current administration decrease economic linkages with China. But I think the predominant view among the German policymakers is that this is just too difficult to achieve, and economic decoupling is no viable policy option. And just to put this in perspective, perhaps, China is Germany's most significant trading partner. Trade with China amounted to 298 billion euros in 2022. By comparison, trade with Russia in 2022 was only 49 billion euros. So I think there is a sense there that decoupling from Russia was just about possible, but decoupling economically from China would be too difficult and too costly for the German economy to achieve. So all of this essentially is a long way of saying that rhetorically, no doubt, Berlin's foreign policy vis-a-vis China seems to have shifted, but substantively, perhaps the focus is on de-risking economic interdependence with China rather than decoupling from China altogether. I just quickly move on to say a few words about France. I think it's a very similar picture for France when we look at the period from Presidents Nicolas Sarkozy right through to Emmanuel Macron today. What I would say is that France has a distinct focus on pursuing autonomy in its relationship with China. France is very keen to highlight that it has an independent China policy that neither aligns with the United States against China, nor aligns with China against Western allies. And I think there's quite a telling quote from the April 2022 election campaign in which Macron told French voters that France is a vassal of neither China nor the United States. And I think the very same message of autonomy, of emphasizing autonomy in its relationship with China, also in light of China's nuclear modernization and military buildup, that also comes through very clearly in the November 2022 French National Strategic Review. And of course, a final point on France really quickly is that when we look at China's nuclear modernization, French observers are very keen to highlight that France has dismantled its facilities for the production of fissile materials completely, whereas China, of course, is the only P5 state that has thus far not adopted a moratorium on the production of fissile material for weapons purposes. So that, of course, is a major concern. And finally, really quickly about the UK, I think on the whole, we see quite a similar policy shift, at least in the rhetoric, in British relations with China. If we look at the period under Prime Ministers Gordon Brown and David Cameron, there appears to have been a so-called golden era in UK-China relations, but that golden era appears to have ended during Prime Ministers Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and most recently Rishi Sunak. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. One of which, of course, is that one of which are bilateral UK-China issues, such as the 2020 Hong Kong National Security Law, which the UK deems a clear and serious breach of the UK-China agreement governing the transfer of sovereignty to Hong Kong. The UK is also very keen to point out Chinese human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And the UK, of course, also has deep concerns related to Huawei's role in the UK's 5G network. When it comes to nuclear policy and sort of the UK perspective on China's nuclear modernization, the UK Integrated Review of 2021 makes quite an interesting statement because it refers to China as a systemic competitor. The 2021 Integrated Review, of course, also increases the UK's ceiling of nuclear warheads to 260. And some observers have made the link between a rapidly deteriorating security environment, not only because of a much more aggressive Russia, but also a rapidly modernizing Chinese nuclear arsenal that justified, that made the UK feel that it's necessary to give it a little bit of flexibility on the size of its nuclear arsenal. I think I'll stop here and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. The relationship in China and Russia is, of course, always very interesting in the nuclear and other areas. It's like the overall relationship changed a lot over time. Initially, as when following the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union was very supportive of China's nuclear aspirations and helped China launch its nuclear program, helped the PRC learn about how to make a bomb, how to do nuclear enrichment, and so on. But the Soviets quickly came to regret this, and Khrushchev, when he was in charge as general secretary, tried to cut off this assistance to stop the China program in its tracks at an early embryonic stage. That failed. The Chinese were able to go ahead and test a bomb, develop long-range missiles, and so on. But it did slow the program down. So it took China a while to build up its nuclear warheads, a while to perfect its nuclear delivery systems, and so on. After the end of the Cold War and the end of the Sino-Soviet rivalry and the establishment of the Russian Federation, the nuclear cooperation has slowly gained in traction. You would argue that this is evident and manifests itself in several areas. We've seen this in terms of their position on important arms control and proliferation issues. So they've both been very critical of Western proliferation-related sanctions adopted outside the UN, especially those, which are many, adopted on their own entities for violating the proliferation standards of the United States and other countries. They've been very critical of Western missile defenses. They've become increasingly negative about U.S. extended security guarantees. That is the U.S. pledge to use all means, including nuclear weapons, to defend allies like Japan and South Korea and NATO partners, NATO allies. At earlier points, they understood the value of these kind of guarantees to dampen the incentive of these countries to develop their own nuclear weapons, but they've become increasingly hostile towards these guarantees, as well as the U.S. alliance structure as a whole. And these has now extended to criticism even more so of the Western nuclear partnerships. That includes the NATO nuclear sharing agreement, which has been long a concern of the Soviets and then the Russians, but has now received a lot of criticism from China as well. And more recently, the AUKUS trilateral defense and cooperation agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. That has nothing to do with nuclear weapons, but their propaganda of Beijing and Moscow has been portraying this as violating the spirit and norms of the NP Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and so on. I imagine this criticism will extend to it if we expand the AUKUS arrangement to include other countries or pursue similar arrangements. Also, as noted by Yusol and others, the cooperation with the West by Russia and China regarding the proliferation-prone policies of Iran and North Korea has been declining. So in the past, we could work in partnership with these countries to some extent on restraining the Iranian and North Korean nuclear ambitions. This is clearly weakened, particularly in the case of related technologies such as the missile developments of these two countries. And this could become even more serious a problem as we go forward with, for example, the support Iran and North Korea is giving to Russia in its aggression against Ukraine. We've also seen direct Russian help to areas that are useful and arguably critical for the improvement of the Chinese nuclear deterrent. This includes helping China build its missile launch train early warning system. The President Putin acknowledged this assistance a couple of years ago, and apparently it's been proceeding as planned. And we've seen increased concerns lately about Russia's plan, the agreement, for example, with the Russian nuclear agency Rosatom to provide the Chinese nuclear corporations with mixed oxide fuel that would allow the Chinese to run the fuel through their breeder reactors and produce even more separated plutonium, which can be used as a fissile material. So in the past, one main bottleneck on the expansion of the Chinese nuclear force has been in their limited amount of fissile material. But as Max noted now, they refuse to adhere to a moratorium and fought against this very vigorously at the recent NPT review meeting. And they're also not transparent of what they're doing in this area. And if they receive the assistance with Russia with their breeder reactors, they'll be able to produce substantial quantities of fissile material. The future speculative, but the Russia-China cooperation in the security realm has been increasing more than many of us thought. And so we could anticipate the possibility of their considering joint development delivery systems, particularly related to hypersonic technology, at least sharing of insights. Perhaps we'll see more explicitly nuclear-related exercises. They've not held one directly related to nuclear issues, but that may be something we will see coming ahead and should therefore plan for. With respect to how the United States has dealt with these challenges, we've seen a lot of continuity, some differences. For example, the Trump administration was very insistent on including China along with Russia in the strategic arms control reduction process, preferably as a formal treaty partner, but at least in some way that would pose legally binding caps on the what they already at that time saw as an expanding China nuclear program. The Biden administration is pursuing a different approach. It still wants to maintain strategic arms control treaties with Russia. With respect to China, for now, they're just trying to get the Chinese more interested in risk reduction measures, more dialogues, more transparency, as a preliminary means to perhaps bring them into the treaty framework later as their forces grow. But there's bipartisan support for continued modernization of the U.S. nuclear deterrent, all three legs of the triad, and the supportive command control and other related capabilities. We've seen bipartisan criticism about China's lax efforts to restrain the North Korean nuclear and missile program, growing concerns about China's activities regarding Iran. The nuclear security cooperation, that is trying to keep nuclear material away from terrorists and criminals and other non-state actors, is continuing. It's just become a lot less visible without the nuclear security summits. But even regardless of that, there's also the problem the Chinese are just less transparent about many of their nuclear activities, such as their increased fissile material production. Which leaves in doubt how secure all this new fissile material really is. We've had some conclusions and recommendations in the report with regard to vertical arms control, how to deal with the growing China's nuclear weapons capabilities. It's hard to see how we're going to maintain a comprehensive, legally binding strategic arms control process unless China participates in some way. I mean, ideally as a formal member of a New START type treaty, or perhaps there's some way to close legally binding caps, but still allow them to maintain some distance from a treaty, maybe sign a protocol or something. But without any formal limits on the China's nuclear arsenal, it's hard to see how we're going to get comprehensive treaties in the future, because it's just very difficult to envision Russia and the U.S. agreeing to limit their forces if China is unlimited. We tried that with the INF treaty, and it didn't turn out too well. But even the efforts to bring China into the risk reduction process is going to have to require the Chinese government to be more transparent, more open to dialogue, sharing, discussion, debate about what it's doing in this area, what its plans and intentions are, and how we can jointly reduce the risks of nuclear escalation, nuclear incidents, and so on. With respect to the nuclear security domain, as China continues to expand its civilian and military nuclear programs, it's playing a greater role already in the civilian nuclear market, selling nuclear reactors to other countries, and it has some of the most ambitious nuclear power plant construction plans still in the world. It's just imperative that the Chinese adopt very rigid safety and security controls over this material, and that they be understood and reviewed by foreign experts who want to support China in this area. And then with respect to non-proliferation, so that is spreading of nuclear weapons to additional states, we looked at this in two different ways. So with respect to states of proliferation concern, namely Iran and North Korea, we don't anticipate that much Chinese help in the near term, but we think it's possible you could perhaps at least limit the damage from the deterioration of the overall relationship over unrelated issues to the North Korean and Iran question. That's the hope. It's going to be difficult to manage, but we have some ideas, and our colleagues also have other ideas on this. And then the question of the spreading of nuclear material, of the aspirations of allies of the United States, the United Kingdom, and others. The pressure growing as you so reviewed particularly in South Korea to develop an independent nuclear deterrent. That's something where the U.S., the UK, and others have to think very hard about how we can meet the needs of these countries for enhanced security, cooperation, and extended deterrence guarantees, short of their having to pursue an independent nuclear deterrent. And thank you very much. That's the end of the summary, but we did want to share some other insights through dialogue. I know that Tome in particular mentioned to me his interest in thinking about how Japan and South Korea are pursuing slightly different approaches to the Chinese buildup. So I was hoping you could perhaps share some of your insights in that regard.
Thank you, Richard. So I think, as I mentioned in my short briefing, that Japan's determination for non-nuclear is strong. So there's, of course, some concerns about deterrence, particularly comparing the South Korea, Japan is Japan's concern of the deterrence, where Chinese-owned North Korean nuclear development is making public concerns in Japan too. But Japan's case, Japan is more emphasis on extended deterrence, where U.S. nuclear umbrella will really covers, and in what cases and how they will be exercised, and how Japan can support the U.S. nuclear deterrence operations. So I remember that maybe 2 years ago, late Prime Minister Abe raised issues of nuclear sharing with the United States. That's not the Japan is trying to possess or develop nuclear capabilities, but I think it's more about how the U.S. nuclear deterrence will be seen more effective. It may be already effective enough, but it should be more clearer for the public or for potential adversaries about U.S. nuclear deterrence is effective on Japan. So Japan decided to upgrade its extended deterrence talks with the United States. We have been conducting those talks at the official levels for maybe at least a decade. I have been participated sometimes, but it was appropriate to the ministerial level, and even extended deterrence discussion conducted between the President of the U.S. and the Prime Minister of Japan in this January this year, where Prime Minister Kishida visited Washington, D.C. And then the same month before the summit, 2+2 meetings where foreign and defense minister of both countries met in Washington, D.C. and confirmed their commitment to extend deterrence. So that's maybe different from the South Korea's response to deterrence. Maybe another difference would be about the Chinese nuclear development. So it seems South Korea has more emphasis on North Korean missiles and nuclear development.
And so I know that you said that that you thought there were important differences between the current Yoon government and the previous Moon government on many of these questions, even within South Korea. So I was hoping you could share your insights on that with us.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Geopolitically, South Korea's core foreign policy is balanced diplomacy. That is to achieve a balance between the United States and China. So South Korea relies on the US for its security, but also maintains strong economic ties with China. The previous Moon Jae-in administration showed more pro-China moves, but the current Yoon Suk-yeol administration is emphasizing strengthening security ties with democratic countries, such as resuming dialogue with Japan and a clearer stance for the US-ROK alliance.
And Yoongjun, I know you're been a close advisor to both these administrations. Do you anticipate any changes in the Yoon approach now that we've seen, for example, a new national security advisor being appointed and President Yoon now being in office for a while and had time to reflect a bit on how best to pursue his policies?
Yes, and now South Korea is very busy about the new position of the National Security Office and also new the ROK ambassador to Washington, D.C. just 3 weeks before the President Yoon and Biden presidential summit. So yeah, but Yoon Suk-yeol's philosophy is very clear. So he tried to focus on the better ROK-Japanese relation regarding to the trilateral security cooperation against the definitely, clearly, openly North Korean threat, but potentially Chinese nuclear and military threat as well. So Yoon administration tried to have a more stronger cooperation. Even some years later, Blue House owner change or not. So now it's institutionalization of a trilateral security cooperation. Also, cooperation with the NATO country as well will be top priority for the Yoon administration. So it is clearly different from the Moon Jae-in administration, but definitely it is a similar sort of about the denuclearization process to North Korea, even though South Korea has a nuclear deterrence debate, including already Dr. Uyes explained about NATO-style nuclear sharing and also South Korea nuclear armament debate. But the denuclearization process is anyway a priority of the Yoon administration as well. So it's a similar approach to of the Moon Jae-in administration as well.
And Max, I know that you gave a very comprehensive review of the past policies of the German, French, and British governments in this area. I don't know if you had time, you've thought about if there was the opposition came to power in any of these governments, whether we might see a different approach to China. And in addition, I know besides the 3 countries, you've also looked at NATO as a whole. So I wasn't sure if you could also share your insights on the NATO approach in addition. So those 2 questions, what might we see in the future, and then how NATO as a whole has been dealing with the China issue.
Sure, thanks very much indeed, Richard. So on the first question on the approaches of the opposition, so at least if we look at the German public discourse on this, some members of the Conservative Party, the Christian Democrats, for instance, have criticized the current Scholz administration for being too soft on China. Having said that, I think even the hawks in the German debate don't really call for an economic decoupling. And I think it's the end of the day, for the reasons that I've already mentioned, there simply is that the perception there that China's economic importance for Germany is simply too great. I mean, we're looking at almost 300 billion euros of the overall trade volume last year. That's a significant chunk. When it comes to NATO, I think what's interesting is that until around 2019, there was hardly any mention within the NATO alliance of the role that China plays for Euro-Atlantic security. I think NATO's internal thinking on a suitable bespoke NATO strategy towards China really began in earnest in 2019 with the launch of the NATO 2030 process. And I think it's also in 2019 that for the first time, China was mentioned in a summit communique, indeed with the London Declaration of 4th December 2019, referring to China for the very first time, but in rather vague terms. It was then, I think, in 2021 with the Brussels summit communique and with the 2022 strategic concept that NATO really fleshed out its thinking on China, essentially stating that China posed systemic challenges to Euro-Atlantic security. So that's quite an important sort of upgrade of the China challenge. And I think what's also interesting with the NATO language on China is that NATO explicitly refers to China's rapidly expanding nuclear arsenal and its increasingly sophisticated delivery systems being a major cause for concern. And I think it's also clear to say that overall, despite this shift in the rhetoric on China, NATO still remains fairly vague on its overall approach to China because there simply is no consensus between the allies on how best to respond to an increasingly assertive China. And I think we see that with some allies like the United States, the UK, Canada, Lithuania, the Czech Republic, seeking to contain a rising China, whereas Hungary, on the other hand, France and Germany are very cautious not to undermine any economic consideration or economic interests. So again, in my view, there isn't an overall consensus among the allies on how to deal with the rising China.
Very good. Okay. I had many more questions, but we've run out of time. So please let me thank the viewers and my colleagues for sharing their insights. Again, I encourage you to read the report, Managing China-Related Proliferation Challenges on the Hudson website, and I look forward to our next session together. Thank you.